Okay, so the Chapter 9 notes were really divided into two portions. The first half, which we've
down. So in 1982, the rate of erosion was about 1.9 tons per hectare. Now, well, I shouldn't say now, but in 2003, the last time this was studied, the rate of erosion is only 5.9 tons per hectare. So when areas are being farmed in 1982, the processes of farming and the processes of grazing and the processes of foresting, we were losing 9.1 tons of soil per every hectare of land being farmed. Today, from 1982 till 2003, it's gone down to 5.9 tons per hectare. Now, that is mostly due, what I want you to write down in your notes, this decrease is mostly due to no-till farming. More and more farmers are not leaving their fields completely bare in the fall and winter months. They're leaving cover crops on that land to try to keep the soil in place. Now, is it still a problem? Yes, we still lose, they estimate, here's another number for you to write down. They estimate we still lose about 5 tons of soil for every 1 ton of grain that is harvested. So for every ton of grain that is harvested in the land of the United States, for every 1 ton of grain, 5 tons of soil are lost. Okay, and it takes a long time for soil to be replenished. This is still a problem, but obviously something we are working to correct. The second type of degradation, land degradation, I want to talk about in a little more detail is desertification. So obviously we know this has something to do with deserts. Desertification occurs in arid environments, and so we're all on the same page. Make sure you understand that arid just means dry environments, so in deserted areas. The Earth, about 40% of the land masses on Earth are arid environments, dry environments that don't get much rain. And the land degradation in these areas occurs from, the same problems we talked about on the general land degradation slide: erosion, deforestation, overgrazing. Because it's arid, because the land is very dry, it impacts the productivity. Any area that has land degradation of more than a 10% loss that's arid is considered to be going through desertification. Any area that is arid that has more than a 10% loss in productivity is considered to be going through desertification. So if I go into an area that's already dry and I start overusing the soil, putting too much salt in the soil, letting the animals graze too much, this will cause a problem very quickly because it's already an arid environment, it's already a dry environment. Most of the degradation simply comes from windstorms and water. If I'm already in a very sensitive environment, remember your IPATS model? If I'm already in a very sensitive environment, there's going to be much more of an impact when the wind starts blowing. Now, right now, where do we hear about this? Right now, we don't really hear about this in the United States. Desertification, what you want to write down in your notes, is right now it's most common in the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent. Okay? But we have had periods of desertification in the United States. In your history class, I'm sure you've talked about the Dust Bowl. This happened during the Depression in the 1930s, and this is a picture from the Dust Bowl. There was just these giant dust storms. And again, imagine that idea of erosion here. You have erosion happening naturally anyway, that dust can blow around. But it's a desert area. It's a dry, arid environment. And it's impacted even more because if there's nothing holding the soil down and the wind starts blowing, you have these massive windstorms that would last for days, blowing the dirt from one area to another. The last thing I want you to write down here, the last thing that I want you to make a note of, is that this might become more of a problem with climate change. Obviously, if climates start to change and we have change in global rainfall patterns, we start to have more areas that are drier or less areas that are drier, that may impact this issue. Right now, about 40% of the earth is arid. If that changes because of climate change and we get more or less arid areas, desertification can become more or less of a problem. So real quick, just one slide here. Let's talk a little bit about the history of soil conservation. In the United States, the soil conservation movement really started back in the 1930s as a direct result of that Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. It was established something called the Soil Conservation Service, the SCS, and you'll see it referred to that a little bit, but it was renamed the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, in 1994, so you'll more commonly see the NRCS associated with soil conservation. And the role of this group is to work with farmers to develop conservation plans. So essentially, you can see the plan outlined right here. People from this service go out, they assess the resources and problems for farmers in an area. They bring science and research to the farmers to help them individually come up with the best plan. They have a list of objectives that they're trying to get everyone to meet, to get everyone to be on the same page, and to think globally, because everyone's sharing the water, everyone's sharing those resources. It is a federally directed program. The program is set up by the federal government. We're going to write that down. And it gets its funding from the federal government. But the program does allow the individual states to organize how the program is run. So it has a hand in the federal and the state level. The states create certain conservation areas that can and cannot be farmed. And more recently, the Act has been strengthened through legislation. It actually now also protects water quality and overall levels of pollution. So you will see that NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, come up again and again. Okay. Remember when you're thinking about this that there are these agricultural extension agencies that farmers can go to and use as resources to find out about the no-till farming, to find out about processes to slow down the degradation of the land. So as these services, as the NRCS works, they've come up with a list of things that farmers can do to prevent degradation and some of the things they're doing to cause degradation. So how do farmers prevent degradation? How do they prevent erosion of the land from happening? Now, something you might want to check out, and you can use your iPad to look at this if you have the online book, or just check out your hard copy of your book later, is figure 9.14. In 9.14, there is a great picture that shows all of these forms of degradation. So I'm just going to touch on them quickly, and then I want you to go look at that, write that diagram down in your notes so you go back and look at it for the test. But these are all things that farmers are learning now and being taught in the United States and throughout the world to slow down land degradation. For example, they're learning to rotate their crops because some things like soybeans and other legumes or beans can revitalize the soil. They're using things like contour farming, creating natural curves in the land and dams essentially to slow the runoff. So if there is a storm and there is a lot of rain, the soil doesn't completely run off their land. That's very similar to terracing, which is done essentially, it's like contour farming but on a slope. This is done a lot in the Himalayas and in the Andes, areas that are very hilly, so that we can farm the land and create little stair steps on the sides of mountains so that the soil doesn't just run straight down from the top of the mountain to the bottom. Intercropping, this is similar to crop rotation, but instead of rotating the whole field, so in crop rotation you have a field of corn and a field of soybeans, and the next year you switch them. Intercropping is doing that in one field, having a strip of corn, a strip of soybeans, a strip of corn, a strip of soybeans, and just rotating those year to year. Shelter belts, these are things that are seen often in the Midwest and in the Great Plains. These are used in areas that are very windy. They set up essentially natural windbreaks. So if this is my field, instead of just farming and putting my rows of soybeans or corn or whatever I'm growing, I actually take taller plants and put them in between. So I might put some tall, maybe bamboo here and here and here as windbreaks. So when the windstorm comes through, the dirt cannot blow out of those small areas. Again, look at figure 9.14 and you'll see a much better picture of that. And then the last thing that farmers can do to prevent degradation is that conservation tilling. We've talked about that a lot. That's that no-till farming. Conservation tilling involves, leaving at least 30% of your crops on the land, leaving a cover to hold the crops in. Now, these are all things that can help prevent erosion. One more thing that I'd like you to jot down in your notes that farmers can do to prevent degradation, to prevent Pollutants from getting into the land is using green manures. So again, these are all forms to prevent erosion. Green manures using